a minimum sentence of 51 years and 190 days. 13 sentences are for life. As you heard the judge say, there is a high likelihood that he will never ever be allowed to leave prison despite not being able to receive a whole life order. 51 years for the murder of 3 children, the attempted murder of many others. And as you heard I've spent a lot of time reporting from court. I've heard a lot of sentencing hearings. I've heard about the worst things that humans can do to one another. And that tops them all. That's the most despicable, disgusting, god-awful description of violence, particularly towards children, I have ever heard. And the lack of remorse, too, that Rudakubana showed was taken into account there by the judge, as you heard. 51 years, minimum sentence for Axel Rudakubana to be served in custody with, as the judge said, a very, very high likelihood that he will never, ever be released from prison. There's a lot to go through, though, in what the judge said. I think it's frankly a very good thing that these sentencing hearings can now be heard in public in full, because it gives people access to the thinking of the judge when they come to the sentencing and the justification for it. Matthew Scott has been listening in, criminal barrister at Pump Court Chambers, legal blogger at barristerblogger.com. Thank you for staying with us, Matthew. Explain how we get to 51 years.
Well, what the judge took as the starting point was the statutory requirement to impose a sentence of 27 years, which is given in the Sentencing Act for somebody under the age of 18 who has committed a murder of exceptional seriousness involving substantial planning and the murder of a child. So that was his starting point. But of course, this was far, far worse even than the single murder of a child.
Yeah.
Because it involved 3 children and all the other associated, the attempted murders, the possession of the ricin, and the just unspeakably horrific way in which the murder was carried out. So 27 years is the starting point, aggravated by all those features. He took the minimum term up to 52 years. What he made clear, though, is that doesn't necessarily mean at all that this man will be released in 52 years' time. It's very likely he won't be, but that is the minimum term. He'll be, by my calculations, about 70 before he's any chance of being released at all.
16 counts. 13 of them have been given life sentences, particularly the most violent ones, but there are also counts for the production of ricin and having the terror manual and the carrying of a knife. One of the things that I think people might listen to in that, if they've not experienced the inside of a courtroom before, and frankly, for most people, that is the situation. Why would they have seen the inside of a courtroom? The judge there talked about a discount. Now, given the horrific crimes that have been committed here, the manner in which they committed, why would there be any room, any need for a discount to that sentencing?
Well, again, the law requires him to give some, in almost every case, to give a discount of some sort for a guilty plea. I suppose in this case, the families may have been spared the anguish of, the thought of
the trial
with this sort of evidence being given, presumably some of it by children or by people who've been deeply traumatized by what they've seen, is almost too awful to contemplate. So I think it's right that in the public interest he was given at least some incentive to plead guilty at the outset. The discount he would have been given is very little. It would have been probably 10% off the minimum term.
But that just to be clear, that is a legal requirement on the judge to take into account in his sentencing or her sentencing the character of the individual, a guilty plea, the age of the individual, those kinds of things.
Yes, the judges have to do that. Otherwise, they would end up being appealed. And one of the reasons you were asking earlier why we had to hear all these details is because the judge needs to set out how he's arrived at his sentence, what he's taken into account in order to get there, so that if there is an appeal, the Court of Appeal can look at his remarks and say, well, he took into account the right things or the wrong things.
And the other issue, Matthew, that I wondered that people would want to raise is this notion of concurrent sentences. So here we have a multitude of similar acts when it comes to murder or attempted murder, but different for each person. But the sentencing will be served concurrently, almost as it were, one on top of the other. Now, in America, the situation is rather different. Just explain why that's the case here, if you could.
Well, I'm not sure it's always different in America, and it can be different here. One can have consecutive sentences. The judge could have imposed consecutive sentences, but what he has to have regard to also is principle of totality. And here, I think if he had simply imposed 50 years consecutively, then that would have been the equivalent of a whole life order. And I think that would have been considered unacceptable by the Court of Appeal.
Unacceptable because of the age of Rudakubana? Because
the statute does not permit a whole life order to be given. I think it would be seen probably as going behind it would be a way of getting round the statute in an improper way. So I think the judge was right to impose a sentence which was somewhat less than a whole life order. He could have done it by giving sentences of about 20 years odd each, and then made them consecutively. That might have seemed far too low for each individual sentence. So what he did was to take the murders as the lead sentence and make all the other sentences concurrent. It's pretty academic, frankly, what the other sentences are. What matters is the total, the 52 years.
Matthew, I'm really, really grateful to you for staying with us and explaining the thinking that the judge laid out in sentencing for one of the most despicable, disgusting, heartbreaking, horrific crimes I think this country has seen, certainly this century.